Welcome everyone to our Australian Society for Computers and the Law Rules as Code Masterclass with AustLII DataLex, the third masterclass in our RAC Masterclass series. Firstly, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and the ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales, Australia. I am Natalia Crnomarkovic. I lead the AUSCL Future Law Working Group, and in my day job, I lead the APAC and Oceania Law Technology and Innovation teams at EY Law. For those of you joining us for the first time, here's a bit of background on the Society. The Society for Computers and the Law is a cross-disciplinary network of professionals, academics, and other leaders working at the interface of law, technology, and society. We provide a forum for learned discussion and debate through our policy lab, working groups, and an amazing events program, of which this series is one. The Society was launched in July last year, but we have a 40-year history. In fact, I remember presenting at the Society many, many years ago when I was a baby lawyer. A special welcome to Honourable Michael Kirby, who I understand is joining us this evening. And indeed, it is an honour to have such a distinguished guest at this masterclass. Now for some quick bios. So today's masterclass will be run by Andrew Mowbray and Philip Chung from AustLII. Andrew is Professor of Law and Law and Information Technology at the University of Technology, Sydney. He is one of the co-founders and co-directors of AustLII, the Australasian Legal Information Institute. Andrew is the author of much of the systems level software that sits behind AustLII, including the Sino search engine, the automated markup software, the law site citator, and the YScript language, which forms the basis of DataLex applications development system. In 2014, Andrew was awarded the New South Wales Law and Justice Foundation's Justice Medal for his 25-year commitment to making legal information available online. And as we'll see today, of course, Andrew continues to push the boundaries here. Philip Chung is Associate Professor of Law at the University of New South Wales. He is Executive Director of AustLII and associated projects, including Asian Law, Common Law and World Law. Philip manages the staff and resources at AustLII and jointly oversees the technical development of AustLII's projects. Philip holds degrees in economics and law from the University of Sydney with honours in computer science and operations research, as well as a PhD in law from the University of New South Wales. Philip's research interests include legal information systems, the computerisation of law, and AI in law. It is a privilege to have such outstanding presenters with us this evening. Now, Andrew, Philip and their teams at AustLII are moving the dial at a global level, in fact, in shaping access and ultimately the consumption and application of law in this digital world. Before we kick off, Andrew and Philip, could you please share something about how you became involved in rules as code and what excites you about this emerging field? I'll hand over to you first, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Natalia. I've been involved with AustLII for like 26 years now, and I've been interested in applications of technology to law for some time before that. A lot of the early history of AustLII and a lot of the work that we've done has been about expanding free access to law, both in Australia and around the world. And that early work revolved around content and making sure that all the players, including the public, have access to the basic components that comprise the legal system in Australia. Increasingly, our work has turned to making that access more effective. And one element of that, perhaps the most recent element of that, has sparked an interest in rules as code. And so we see RAC as a way of making legislation more understandable, more accessible, more useful to all of the players. And I guess in terms of what makes it exciting is not just that, but I think that it has the potential to influence other technologies, and in particular, we think that the representation of law in forms which facilitate rules as code can be used in lots of other ways, and particularly in the context of the semantic web and the generation of other forms of knowledge and applications from those forms. I guess ultimately the final thing I'll say is that thinking about these issues of how the law should be made and how it should be presented and how it should be constituted is really important. And I think that technology in this case, I hope, not only leads to sort of more effective law, but actually better law. Thanks, Natalia. That's my say.
Philip?
Thanks, Natalia. Thanks, Andrew. I was just going to add to what Andrew said. My interest goes way back. I think I remember doing projects when I was at university. It was the internet and the web was just starting up at the time. And I was just trying to figure out what do I want to do with my, at the time, studying both computer science and law. And someone said, look, there's this AustLII organization just started. And I said, oh, I don't know what that is about. So, but it actually led me to, as Andrew said, 25 plus 1 year journey. I was, I think, the second employee at AustLII. So, and I've been very interested in the intersection of law and technology, and in particular, how we can use that combination to, for social justice and create public good. What we can do with that combination is always an interest of mine. And I guess in a way I see the rule as code as adding layers on top of what we've done to date. On AustLII, we have a lot of content with cases, legislation, law journal articles, and so on. So we have a great building blocks for adding more value. And as Andrew said, increasing the accessibility to the law. So I see rules as code as another layer where we can open up a lot of potential about what it can do. I mean, at the moment, I think Natalia is saying it's emerging, so we actually don't know where the journey takes us. So I find, with the society running this masterclass, I think it's a very exciting opportunity for us to look at different approaches, different perspectives on what we can do with both the technology, but also the policy, and what is it that we're trying to drive in terms of the outcome. So I think that these classes provide, or this community, if you like, provides with a good opportunity to explore all those different options. As Andrew said, let's hope we get a better outcome with those combination. Thanks, Natalia.
I have no doubt that will be the case, Philip. Creating better law, transparency, accountability, and ultimately leading to a better working world, a better world for all. So just quick reminders before we kick off. This session will be recorded, so please keep yourself on mute and cameras off. Use the Q&A function, not the chat function, for queries. Our presenters will address your questions after the masterclass during our Q&A session. So now over to you. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay. Can I just start with a thank you to the Australian Society of Computers and Law. I think this series of masterclasses is really important, and it's helping to pursue the rules as code cause. And can I thank particularly Natalia for her kind introduction, and Marina for all the organisation, and also can I acknowledge Emma Drake from the University of Newcastle, who's sitting in the background here, and making sure all of the technology works for our session. AustLII, just for people who I guess don't know, I guess most people do, but just so that we're all on the same page. As Phil said, we've been around for a long time. We were formed in 1995. And basically, AustLII provides basic legal infrastructure to higher education, but more importantly to the legal system itself. And by that, I mean all of the players, governments, courts, the legal profession, and so on. It's the most relied upon service for accessing legal information in Australia. In an average day, we get about 650,000 direct accesses. Our data content, as Phil alluded to in his little introduction, includes about 870 databases, and I'm describing it here as including near comprehensive coverage of Australian law. It's always a dangerous statement to make because you always think of more things you could add. But it certainly, you know, their earliest case on AustLII goes back to 1788, and our breadth includes virtually all tribunals and courts and other sources of law. We also operate internationally. We are members, in fact, founding members of the Free Access to Law movement, which I think has grown now to 67 different providers around the world, providing access to well over 100, possibly 150 even countries and their legal systems. AustLII itself is a joint facility of UTS and University of New South Wales, and we're physically based at UTS. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is what we think rules as code is. Then basically, not terribly originally, I'm going to talk about the rules and then the code, and then the two together. And so we're going to talk about what rules exist and what can be done with them, how they're comprised. We'll talk about our version of how we regard this as being convertible or representable in code. And I'll talk about this YScript language, which is how we do that. We'll then talk a little bit about the development platform. And at some point during this, I'll change over to Philip, and Philip can then take us through the platform, and he can talk about some application interfaces. So once you've actually developed all this stuff, what can you do with it in a practical sense? So what do we mean by rules as code? Rules as code for us refers to the creation of machine consumable, or what we like to call executable, versions of laws and other types of rules. Whenever I say rules, I guess I'm really talking about legislation and legislative instruments, because that's the sort of thing that we're principally focused on. But this sort of technology can also work for things that are law-like. So, you know, codes of conduct, you know, internal rules for organisations, I guess university rules, for example, or anything which basically is represented as a set of statements of principle in some sort of organised way. Rules as code is important for us, as we've said a few times now, mainly because we see it as something which makes the law more accessible. You know, and this is what really drives AustLII. We basically were set up to provide free access to the law and to promote free access to the law. And as I said, we see technologies like rules as code as a mechanism to make the law more accessible, you know, to be more effectively accessible, I guess. It's also important from an economic and business perspective. And it's really one of the nice features of these two propositions I put here about accessibility and having a business effect, if you like, is the two often go together. And rules and code is an example of where if you do something which has a social good, it also has an economic good that flows from it. So there are two basic approaches to rules as code. And I guess a lot of the focus is on the first of the things I've put here that focus on sort of changing the way that rules are actually made so that you've got different official, quote, end quote, versions of those rules. Now, one in natural language for humans, the sort of stuff we're used to, although I guess some non-lawyers mightn't think that the average piece of legislation is too intelligible, but it's designed to be usable by humans anyway. The other form that that you do is you produce a separate one for machines, a separate executable form. Okay? And you know, if you're going to follow this approach, you make both of those things enforceable. You make both of those things authoritative, if you like. A second way of doing things, and this is actually sort of where I'm going to finish up in my bit of the presentation at least, is you can also write rules in a way which is both machine intelligible as well as being human intelligible. And as we'll see in one of my final examples, the two things are actually not that far apart. It's not that impossible to write things in a human way that are also usable by computers. And the final point, I'll get onto this in the next slide, is, well, we also have to do something with all of the existing rules. And on the next slide, I've got a few figures here, which I just gathered off the AustLII system. Now, in our relatively uncomplicated country, although I suppose for a small country, we are a federation, 6 states, 2 self-governing territories, some non-self-governing territories as well, and various levels of government. But there's around about 1.7 million legislative sections I could find on AustLII. There's a lot of existing rules that you just can't ignore. We need to somehow cope with these. And we need to have some way of being able to deal with them if we're going to really have a serious impact with the technology like rules as code. Now, the legislation also, the other thing about it, which is interesting that we can get from the AustLII system, is that it also attracts a lot of interest. A lot of people, even though it's not the most exciting reading matter that there is, we get about 96 million accesses to legislation each year, just on AustLII. So, there's a lot of this stuff and a lot of people are interested in it. If you look at what the rules say, if you look at it sort of clause by clause, section by section, rules, increasingly, legislation does all sorts of different things. It's basically a modern trend is to list the broad principles and objectives and policies of legislation, and then typically this is now done at the part level, and there's an increasing tendency to include this material as part of substantive bodies of statutes in particular. Sometimes the legislation will provide factors. It'll just tell you, well, look, if you're trying to determine, who should take care of a child, in relation to the Family Law Act, for example, it'll tell you, well, look, the paramount interest of that of the child, and it basically gives you some guidance as to the sorts of things you should consider when you're trying to figure out how to best implement those best interests. There's a lot of definitions, legislation, a lot of sections love defining things, and legislation is often about recursive definition. It can make declarations, it can declare, if it's a regulation, it can declare that the fishing season starts on a particular date. Legislation can impose obligations on people. I mean, criminal obligations are the most obvious example, but they can also impose obligations in terms of consumer law, or other matters that tax and the like. Or they can give you rights, different types of rights, property rights, what have you. Felt a lot of legislation is just self-referring. It refers to other sections within the acts or regulations or whatever type of rules they are. Or even more commonly, legislation is about how the legislation is changed, amending acts. So, and this is not meant to be exhaustive, this list. It's just meant to make the point that if you try to characterize what legislation is actually doing, there's a huge diversity of things that it's doing, is the only real answer to that. So if you look at the structure and nature of legislation as it exists now, it is generally expressed following quite formal structures. And, we have sections are numbered, they're sub-numbered. And this is done for the reason of, I guess, trying to be precise, but also allowing lawyers to be able to refer to different issues and components of legislation when they're justifying a decision or when they're trying to explain why an outcome should be the way it is. Within that structure, within this, sometimes quite complicated structure that can include parts, divisions, schedules to legislation, sections, subsections, subsections, and the like. As I was trying to explain in the previous slide, if you try and describe what's within that structure, it's quite complicated. And really, where we come at this is we just say, well, let's just not try and really try and impose any sort of logic on what's within the structure. Let's just say they're propositions. Okay? And let's just use very simple propositional logic, logic that doesn't attempt to divide up statements, logic that just says a statement is what it is. And the types of propositions, if we do want to classify them nevertheless, at least, and again, I'm sure that there are other things that should be on this list that aren't. They can be substantive. Okay, so you can actually say something about the real world. So the example I've given here is how much somebody earns. Okay, that's a statement of fact. They either earn it, they don't. Well, I suppose actually that's a tax lawyer might disagree with that proposition. Whether somebody earns perhaps something which can be subject to argument, but it's something that exists, outside of the terms of the application of the piece of legislation that we're looking at. It also can contain, these propositions can be explicit structural propositions. Okay, so they can basically refer to some other part of the structure. So you can say something like, if part 2 applies, then there's some consequent proposition. Okay, so they can be explicit and refer to structure. The next examples, I should have come up with a better example, but within what should be a proposition, sometimes there's some inherent structure actually combining, if you like, sub-propositions. I mean, in a perfect world, you'd hope that these sub-propositions were divided out and inserted into the overriding structure. But unfortunately, the legislative drafting practices are not that precise. And so often you get things like this statement, section 1A applies, so that's an explicit structural proposition, and some other section here, 1B applies. Okay, so it's actually a proposition which is composite, if you like. And finally, you get propositions which are structural, but they're not referring to things within the existing structure that you're actually defining with an act or regulation. So they're referring to things in other acts. Or I guess a really common one is, if you're talking about a regulation, it quite often is referring to its parent legislation, its parent act. So all of these things are quite common. So if we take, an example of a fairly typical piece of legislation, we were just trying to find something that was short. This is a section from the Patents Act. And you can see some examples there, so you've got a self-referring example right at the beginning. This section applies. So it's actually referring to itself, it's structural in that sense. And then the second one, I guess, is referring to something that has actually happened or not. So a complete specification has been amended. I mean, that might be subject to definition as well. Like quite easily we could have a definition of amendment, but ostensibly that's a self-standing proposition. Then again, the next one is referring to another section, so it's referring to the structure within the legislation. And then so on, and as we go through, you can see that there's this mixture of things which are either existing in the real world or existing as propositions of things that are external to the legislation, or references to propositions which refer to the legislation itself or other legislation, and sometimes combinations of these in one of these things within the structure. So if you're going to represent that, it looks a little bit like this. And so we've got at the top here, section 114.1. Okay, it's basically determining this proposition, section applies, and then that's made up of subcomponents in the structure, each of which we can represent as a structural proposition. And then within each of those, we finally get, as we go down the structures, we finally get, I guess, sort of leaf nodes in this little tree, this little directed graph, that are basically fairly real world types of things. They're not that real world, but they're not least structural. So that's our conceptual model of what a piece of legislation or what rules look like. We don't attempt to do anything more than that. We look at the legislation simply as a connected graph of propositions, essentially. So to try and make some sense of what we're now going to go on and talk about and demonstrate. One of the things which we've been trying to get across when we're talking about this is, what it actually does. And so if you excuse the order here, what I'd like to do is I'd like to actually show one of the systems we've built running. So you can sort of see the objective that we're trying to achieve in what we're doing. And the example that I'm going to use is a recent one, Australia's Foreign Relations Act. This has been in the news again today, I noticed. But it's essentially a piece of legislation that was introduced last year by the federal government to do two things. Firstly, it's designed to regulate what state governments can do in terms of their dealings with foreign governments and agencies, foreign governments, departments and agencies. But the other thing, interestingly, it does, working in a university, is that it also tries to regulate, in fact, it does regulate, the relationships that universities can have, both with foreign governments, same thing, but also with other universities. So it's something which working in a university is causing, a degree of interest, because we now have this additional compliance requirement amongst all the other things that universities have to comply with. So this application I'm going to show you is just something that was done just over a couple of afternoons. It's not a life work by any stretch of the imagination. And it's capturing all the bits of this legislation that relate to universities. So I'll run a consultation. So this is, if you like, the end result of what we're trying to achieve. And this is running in the development interface. So this sort of tends to show you what's going on. It's not really intended for end user deployment. This is something that you would use when you're developing. And I'll show you in a minute how we can develop things. So it's asking me some questions. First thing it wants to know is whether or not what I'm interested in is a variation of an existing arrangement, because the Act applies to lots of different aspects of arrangements, but including variations. But that's not complicated. Let's just say we're not going to have a variation. You see already over on the right-hand side of the screen, it's starting to make some conclusions. Okay, so just by answering that question, it's taken out a few little subsections here, and you can actually ask it, why isn't that applying? And basically it's saying, well, that only applies to variations, and you just told me it's not a variation. All right, so that's fairly obvious. What's the name? Well, let's say, let's be non-controversial, and we'll just be interested in a student exchange agreement. So a Wuhan student exchange. Is it between an Australian entity and an Australian entity? Well, it's the Foreign Relations Act. It'd be pretty boring if it wasn't. So I think we better say yes. Is it a written agreement? We can also, at this stage, ask the system why. And one of the things which we think is incredibly important if you're going to build rules as code is the systems have to be able to explain themselves. They have to be able to explain what they're doing, when they're doing it. And at the end of the day, if they're going to give you some sort of answer to a problem, they need to be able to tell you why. They need to tell you why as well. So in this case, I might say, well, look, why are you asking me that? And I'll come back and I'll say, well, that'll help. I'm interested at the moment in whether under the Section 9 definition, whether it's an arrangement. And, you can keep going, why is that important if you want to? And that'll help determine whether it's an arrangement and so on. You can keep going. So is it a written agreement? Well, I think we say yes, it is. What's the name of the entity? Well, let's say it's UTS because it's a university. Now, you notice as soon as I do that, I get great swathe of conclusions. This is because there's the system has some a little bit of just common sense knowledge about things that are universities and things that aren't. And as soon as you're a university, a whole bunch of stuff in the Act just comes out of play. So it's made this bundle of conclusions. Anyway, so say the thing we're dealing with here is the Wuhan University. It's in China. It's a foreign university. Now, this is the whole point about this Act. It's saying, well, you know, are there members of the Chinese Communist Party on the board of governors of Wuhan University? And I'm not sure, but I imagine there's a fair chance that that could be the case. So let's just say there are. And this is something in the Act to try and stop the Act affecting trade and commerce, but it doesn't really apply to universities, so no. It's not specifically dealt with in the rules as not being a foreign entity. The rules can provide for things to be excluded from the Act. This isn't. Has it already entered into it? Let's say it has. Pre-existing, what it's asking about here is, did this pre-exist the operation of the Act itself? And under the legislation, universities are given 6 months basically to get their house in order. And that's, if you're following the papers at the moment, there's a number of universities who are having to apply to DFAT or having to notify DFAT about agreements prior to the deadline for this. But let's just make this a bit faster and say it's not a pre-existing agreement. It's not exempt under the rules. Have we notified the minister? Again, let's just do this quickly. If I say yes, it'll start asking me about, have I done this and have I done that to satisfy all the requirements of the Act? So I'll just go no. And that'll get me to the end of the session. And basically I get back an incredibly formal set of reasoning for why it is that UTS in this case, if it had done this, and this is a fictitious example, but if this had been the case, then UTS technically would not have complied with the legislation. And it's basically because it's a non-core foreign arrangement. It's non-core because it's not between a state government and a foreign government, which would turn it into being a core agreement. It's run out of time to be able to comply, to notify, because it's hasn't done so within 2 weeks. And then it goes through each of these subcomponents and explains why it is that that's the case, right down to, if you read far enough into the report, it will go into the fact that, well, the Act has actually commenced because it has received royal assent. So it gives you a very, very formalistic, very legally correct version of whether or not there's been compliance with this legislation. So for us, this is where we want to get to. Like, we want to be able to work with legislation so that we can fully explain how it's working, and we want to be able to work with it, to be able to throw scenarios at it, to alter scenarios, and then ultimately what you do with this is another matter. You know, so this can then, I mean, it's useful in its own right, but this can then be simplified and presented to a real end user. You know, saying, hey, tick, you haven't got a problem, or, you know, saying, look, you know, you really do need to go and get some legal advice about this if you're trying to give advice to somebody who's not a lawyer. You know, or, you know, we may be using this for some other purpose entirely, you know, where we're using the structure and organisation to do something that's actually unrelated to this sort of reasoning. You know, potentially we could use the formalisation that we created to do this, for example, to actually help search. You know, because in developing this representation, the resultant structure, the resultant code is actually encompassing knowledge that can be used for other purposes. Anyway, I'll get onto that later, and maybe Phil might talk a little bit about it. What's behind this, what actually produced what you just saw is this. And this is about 1,000 lines of code. It basically was created, as I say, over a couple of days, just sitting down with the axe, starting at the first section and just mapping it across. So if you follow this through, once we get through a few little definitions of things in it, we have a rule for the long title, and it doesn't do much other than tell you, hey, the long title of this act is this, and similarly that the short title is this. We get into sections. Okay, it's starting to look a bit more like a computer program now. Where basically, even though it's still fairly reusable, it's starting to look, it's got some calculations and things in there. It's got I was talking before about AUSCL nowadays like to set out their objects, and that's what all this is. And then finally, I'll just skip through these definitions, and I'll just briefly show you some of the body of the act once it gets going. Once it actually gets going, it starts to look like this in terms of its implementation. Section 5.1 applies if 5.1a applies and B's applies. And if you remember back to what I was saying at the beginning, this is the structure that we're trying to capture as propositions. The other thing to notice about this is that there is no textual translation of this. Everything you saw running in that previous example came out of this code. So one of the nice things that we'll see about the language you're using here is these propositions, these English language propositions, are automatically capable of being transformed into questions and put into the positive or the negative form, to actually create those dialogues that you saw. Okay, you don't have all this textual baggage that's hanging around, that sometimes you see in more symbolic systems. And it's also a fairly, as we'll see in a second, fairly English-like in the way that it works. So I'll come back to slides now, and we're on to the code. You just saw an example of it, all right? That big chunk of code that was driving the Foreign Relations Act application. What's behind that is this language called YScript. And YScript is a language which we've been developing for a long time, but it's had a fair amount of rapid development over the last year or so to really make it work well with rules as code, with the application which we're trying to put it to. But fundamentally, YScript is a language which manipulates and represents propositions. Okay, so in some senses, YScript is a conventional programming language. I won't put them up and bore you, but if you read the manuals and the documentation that we produced for YScript, you can use YScript to calculate a value of pi, something mathematical like that, if that's what you want to do. It's not a very good thing to use YScript for, but it's a language in the same sense as any other computing language, C++, Java, Ruby, Perl, Python, whatever, computing languages. But this one's, the things that are different about this one, YScript has this quasi-natural English-like code. It's got this ability to represent propositions as English propositions and the ability to manipulate them to create a dialogue, which comes up in a few points down. It's really easy to learn. I mean, we've used this with students. Typically, we give students about an hour or so to learn the real basics of it. And they're normally pretty happy to then go away and actually produce code. This is a little more technical. It's declarative, imperative. It's rule-based. You can write things that represent what things say, not what they do. Okay, and you can worry about what they do later. So you just represent what it does, and you leave the actual effect of it up to the YScript interpreter to actually produce. But if you really want to do something imperative, you can use YScript also to generate documents, for example, which is essentially an imperative procedural process. And if you want to do that, you can. I've said it produces dialogues, explanations. And the other thing about YScript, apart from being, a solid thing, it's scalable, and you can use what we call contexts within YScript to build applications which involve multiple pieces of legislation, multiple authors, to build, fairly large and sophisticated applications. If you're going to use it for rules as code, it's suitable for representing legislation according to the model which I've talked about. Okay, it represents things quite well as a structured set of propositions. It's something which is fairly natural to do in YScript. Importantly, it allows a slightly overused term in this area, but isomorphic, genuine one-to-one representation. And as I say, the normal methodology, if you're just writing straight into YScript, is you sit down at section 1, you mightn't even know what the act does when you start writing, and you just work your way through the legislation. And then as you go through, you'll basically realise that, oh, this bit relates to that bit, and you might want to make sure they work together. But it's essentially isomorphic, which is really important with legislation, not just because it helps implementation, but it promotes transparency, it promotes the ability to explain why conclusions are the way they are, for example. And really importantly, it's maintainable so that, if some part of the act gets changed or a section gets changed, you haven't got to sit there with thousands of pages of code that nobody remembers how it works and try and make a change. You just know that's the bit that relates to section whatever, go in and change it. We've demonstrated that it can be directly created and maintained by lawyers and law students. It doesn't need a computing scientist to deal with it. It's really important in practical senses because it's very difficult to amass the resources of having to put together expensive lawyers and expensive computing scientists to build things. As I said before, the nice thing about it, because it's got this declarative ability, it allows you to say what rules say, not what they do. Lawyers are really good at doing like flowcharts of decisions. And what does this really do? How do I solve this problem? And to an extent, that works. It works for small, simple problems. Once the problem becomes really big, maybe say more than 100 nodes or something like that, certainly anything more than 1,000 nodes, it becomes pretty incomprehensible and impossible to maintain. So it's important to have some way of being able to say, here's the rules, here's the legislation, here's the representation. And you don't have to worry about what it does. And that's a very important part of what we do. So let's get practical. What I'm going to do is just take a little bit of what we've been looking at, the example that we've been looking at. And I'm going to write a little bit of YScript code and just show you that this is something which is easy to do. So I'm just going to choose this little bit of section 12 of the Foreign Relations Act, the one we've just been looking at. And it doesn't do much. All it does is it says an arrangement is a subsidiary arrangement if it's entered into under the auspices of an arrangement and it's not itself a foreign arrangement. Yeah. I guess it's not quite recursive, but it's got elements of being recursive about it. So I'll switch now back to the live system. I'm hoping everyone doesn't follow along with me because I'm not sure our system will cope with the load if you're doing this, but you could. If you go to datalex.org, it's all there. You can use this stuff. And what I'm going to do in the interface allows me to import just the raw text of any of the legislation that we have on AustLII. So in this case, I'm just going to import section 12 into the application here. And I might just, maybe this would be a bit better if I think I can, yeah, it's a little better, a bit bigger. Maybe even a bit bigger still. Right, so I'm only going to do the first bit, so I don't need all of these. Okay, so this is just the stuff directly from the Act. I don't really need the first bit of this. It's not saying much. In fact, I probably don't even need that bit. Okay, but the rest I'm going to try and model. And so it's section 12. So in YScript, I'll do something like this. Okay, so I'm just starting to write some YScript code there. So first thing you'll notice with YScript code is all the important stuff is in capitals. Okay, they're the keywords that hold the thing together. And you only need about a dozen of these, or even perhaps not even that, to be able to build the whole system. But so in this, we basically got a thing that's introducing a rule. It's called section 12. Doesn't really matter, to be honest, what you call it, but giving it a name like that is handy if you want to find out what it relates to in the original Act. Provides, finishes it, and starts the rule. The outcome of this rule is whether or not an arrangement is a subsidiary arrangement of a foreign arrangement. And in YScript, you'd write that if as only if. Okay, that's like in YScript, that's effectively a propositional assignment. It's like a Boolean assignment, if you like. So it's basically going to say, I'm going to determine a value for the proposition, an arrangement is a subsidiary arrangement only if something happens. And the something, I could just go on and join it with those others, but I'd lose the structure if I did that. So I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say only if section 1A applies, and sheet here, because I don't like typing. Oops. Oh, hang on. Now I'll stuff that up. Start again. Why did that happen? Hit the wrong key. Let's go back. Section 12.1a applies. Maybe I'll just type it the slow way. Section 12.1b applies. Now, if I ran this at this stage and I didn't have the other text, it would just come up and it'd ask me a question and say, does 12.1a apply? If you said yes, it'd then ask you, does section 12.1b apply? And if you answered yes again, it'd say, an arrangement is a subsidiary arrangement of a foreign arrangement. But that's probably not that useful. What I really want to do is go on and define each of those. So if I go on and define rules for those subsections, let's get ready to do the second one as well. So it's going to be B. And the first one is going to be for this thing. Okay, and the second one is going to be for this thing. And the first one is going to relate to that bit of the rule, or that bit of the legislation. And the second one's going to relate to that. Again, put some only ifs in because that's the only way these things are going to be true. You don't really need the A's anymore, so that can go. Just to make it, I don't need the indenting, it just makes it look a bit prettier. Get rid of all the trailing punctuation and stuff. Same thing here, maybe get rid of that dot. And that's it. I've got myself a piece of executable code. That's a piece of YScript code. And if I run that, this is where it's a really bad idea to try and write code live during your presentation, but I've done it. Let's see if it works. There we go. So it's now asking me the question. So you notice it's turned the proposition around into a question. You know, I can ask it, why do you want to know this? And I'll say that'll help determine whether or not 12.1a applies, because we had the proposition that related to 12.1a. And is the arrangement under a foreign arrangement? Say it is. This should make it fail. Is the arrangement a foreign arrangement? Yes. And we end up with this conclusion. The arrangement is not a subsidiary arrangement because 12b doesn't apply. It doesn't apply because it's not a foreign arrangement. Right. So that's the sort of process of writing simple code, and that's the bit of the system which is solid. And if you want to sit down, if you want to go to datalex.org, you can write code for any piece of legislation pretty much, and you'll get something which will run in the way that we've demonstrated. What we're working on now, and what we can do with this is, if I take that same piece of code, so I'm just going back here, getting my section 12. Okay, if I just take that same little snippet that I started with, okay, just this. Okay, remember when I did some minute ago, I sat here and I hand typed, made some mistakes while I was doing it, some YScript code. Right, what we've been developing is a way to give you a first cut of that without you having to type all the detail. And that's what this YLegis thing's all about. So if I hit this little button here, YLegis, it'll turn it into code. All right, so we've started with something which is straight out of the Act. We've ended up with a bit of YScript. In this case, a little unusually, I must confess, it's actually done a pretty brilliant job. It's actually translated into something which is going to run. Okay. It's actually almost exactly what I wrote, provided you just ignore this first little bit where it's put it into a wider context of a bigger section. So from there on down, it's almost exactly what I've done. If I want to do something bigger, okay, so if I take the whole section and I process it, I've now got the basis for implementing the whole section, okay, expressed in YScript. If I'm more ambitious and I want to do the whole act, if I leave out the section number, I import in the whole act. Equally, by the way, you could just cut and paste in the legislation you wanted and that'll work just as well. But here we go. So I've now got quite a large piece of legislation. And again, it won't do it like this. If you run this, it won't be so great. There'll be bits of gobbledygook coming out of it and so on that you're going to need to fix. You're going to need to know how to deal with YScript to be able to get them to work. But you've got a really good start for writing an application about the whole act. And certainly some of the more basic sections, it's actually done the whole job for you. So there's not really any other way to do the short title, for example. That's all you can really do if that's what you're trying to capture. So coming back just very briefly to my slides here. What we've just demonstrated is, we've got this YScript language. It's a good way of being able to represent propositions. Legislation turns out to have a lot to do with propositions, at least when you conceptualize it in the way that I've suggested. And it gives you, and we've got some tools that make it easier for you to convert one to the other. The other thing you could do with it is that YLegis, the other way of looking at it is that if you give YLegis exactly what it wants, if you actually put the code into the form that it's expecting, and that is essentially a structure that has entire propositions that are sensibly named, then it will produce perfect code every time. So if you actually can write your legislation so that it's in a slightly more formal fashion than it actually is at the moment. At the moment, drafters tend to divide propositions across sectional boundaries and across subsections, for example. They don't always tell you how the sections relate to each other necessarily. But if you make sure that as a matter of drafting you do that, then suddenly we've got something which is both humanly readable legislation and something which is code. and can be executed. So the example I've got here is a fairly simple, oops, hang on, I didn't want to do that just yet. I want to do this. The example that I've got here is a fairly simple one, the Hairdressers Act. So piece of legislation, it's only got 12 sections. They were going to abolish it, but they decided it was probably a good idea that, that hairdressers should be qualified. And what you've got here on screen is the first part of a slightly formalised version of that act. And basically all I've done, or the only real changes that I've made from the original act is I've made sure that each bit within this structure, that ACD is correct as they repealed B. But I made sure that within the structure, each thing is actually really a proposition. And I've also, for example, here included the dependencies between sections. So, you know, there's some other section, as we'll see, that determines whether or not section 3 applies. And so I've included that. So if you wrote the legislation like this, okay, so in the whole act, I'll just click through to here, ends up looking a bit like this. So I'll just cut and paste that now. So I've now expressed the whole of the Hairdressers Act, the whole 12 sections of it, okay, in a language which YLegis is going to relate to, and which is also happens to be perfectly good a human set of rules, a set of rules that's humanly intelligible. I can now go into my interface here, and I can just cut and paste that in. Okay, so here it is. Nothing up my sleeve. All right, it's basically, well, except for I forgot the one on the first section. I didn't cut and paste quite rightly, but oh, actually, I think I've lost the first section. Doesn't matter. I'll just lose the whole thing. Okay, so that's it. Now, if I run that through the processor, it produces a set of rules that when I run it, they will actually run properly and give you a perfect result. So if I run the section which is at the core of the act, whether a hairdresser must be qualified or not, okay, I'm getting back bits of English and it's going to give me English conclusions. So do they receive a fee? Yes, they receive a fee. And no, they've got no sort of qualification, nothing in the regs, there's nothing in the Apprenticeship Act that's going to help them. There's no other sort of license. They're not apprentice under direction of somebody. They're not doing it as a doctor in a hospital or something. They're not in an old age home, and there's nothing else in the regs that helps them. Then I get a perfectly good English result, perfectly good set of conclusions. You know, the whole thing now is it's both rule and it's code. All right, so now what I'll do is I'll pass over to Philip, and I'll let Philip talk about, you know, once you've done all this, once you've taken existing legislation and put it into code, or perhaps you've even managed to convince drafters to draft in a format which can be directly converted into code by the system, what do you then do with it? And Philip will also talk a little bit more about how the interface works. So I just need now to figure out how to stop sharing, and I'll pass over to Philip. Philip? You're on mute.
Thanks, Andrew. Before I move on to look at the interface issue, I just thought I'll spend a little bit more time about the to have a look at the development tools themselves. I think Andrews have shown you a couple of examples through this form. Well, I'll just use another example, say the Crimes Act 1914 and Commonwealth, and this time I'm looking at section 15 KP. So I just imported the section there. As Andrew sort of mentioned previously, we can then now run YLegis, the preprocessor, to give you, just to show you another section that sort of work in this way. But this time I just want to demonstrate some of the other features of the development toolkit that we have here available for use. And by the way, I think Andrew mentioned this before, these tools are available for anyone to try. So after this presentation, please feel free to log on, to access datalex.org and click on the development tools link, and then you can have access to this interface and you can play around with the different sort of legislation that we have on the AustLII system. When we're developing the code base, as Andrew mentioned, we work with propositions, facts a lot of the times in terms of trying to figure out how they all connect and work together. So one of the tools we have available under under this interface is this button called check fact cross references, which basically take the code and then it converts it, and just to show you how each of those facts are related in a textual way. Okay, so those marked with asterisks are the ones that it concludes. Those marked with the dash are the ones it uses to get to those conclusions. Okay, so that's I've used a very simple example, so it's easy to sort of look at it in this textual format. But when we work with more complicated sections, it might be more more easily looked at and more easily checked, if you like, if there was a visual interface as well. So what we've done is when you're looking at the cross-check fact cross references here, you can actually visualize those connections. So if I click on that, you can see that little, the larger blue dots sort of shows you, you need those two facts, if you like, to conclude that particular fact the person may acquire or use an assumed identity. And if you follow that sort of diagram, you could see, you can say, well, in order for you to get to that, you actually need to look at 15KB to come to check to see if it applies. So this view, if you like, provides a visual context with that cross references in terms of the facts. And this is very important when you're actually doing large application, because a lot of the time YScript is case sensitive. So you might actually have a typo in terms of capitalization or using short form, using sec instead of sections and so on. So a view like this would help you identify some of those issues that you're working with. You can also check the translation. So you want to see how your dialogue, if you like. So all the dialogue is generated from your code base. So you can click on the check fact translation and it gives you an idea about what the question might look like to the users that's looking at it. So it puts in a positive, puts in a negative, and so on. So you could see all the different propositions we have, what they would look like in text when they are being used in the application. So there are a couple of the few of those tools that are useful when you're actually developing code. Now, the other thing I want to demonstrate here is that, and I think in fact there are some questions already in Q&A about context. And in law, as we know, a lot of the time, and when you're doing rules as code applications, you can't actually code everything. Okay, so one of the things that we, and one of the, I guess, unique feature of the AustLII DataLex platform, if you like, because it has all the legislation, case law, and journal articles and so on behind it, we can actually create links to help people, to help users, if you like, interpret what some of the meaning of that. So just to demonstrate that quickly, if we use the same example, 15KB, this time I click on extract links. So in other words, ask the system when it imports it, bring across with it all the links it sees from the sections that would help to identify some of the context and interpretation issues there. So this time, if I run YLegis preprocessor, and I'll just quickly run the consultation so you can see how those links actually work. So you can see now by adding those links in the code base, we can have links to the AustLII database. So if we want to know what an authorized person is, we can click on that, and that gives us the meaning of what an authorized person is under that particular act. So again, that helps with that interpretation of contextual issues that you need to deal with a lot when you're dealing with legislation and so on. Now, Andrew talked about scaling up and dealing with whole acts. And in fact, in our plan, in terms of what rules code can be, what we could be looking at are actually projects that involve multiple acts. Okay, so obviously might be bigger than what one person can actually do. So I'll just give a very quick example of how that could be done in terms of using, I think Andrew mentioned the language feature. You can use the context within the section, within the act that you're looking at. But we can also then, once you have that, and if multiple people are working on one project, you can actually include different code bases. So in this case, is as an example, in fact, example that we're working with students, where students were each asked to work on different sections, and at the end, we include different code bases into the application, and when it runs, it brings all the rules together. So that's another way that we see where we can scale up and where we develop collaborative applications in that way. And the other thing I should flag is that when, in terms of the AustLII communities or DataLex community, if you like, for those that have got a login account into it, you can actually edit. So if I wanted to, I can actually make changes to the code, and that gets saved and hosted on the application itself. They just use a fairly standard wiki interface, and hopefully that would reduce the barrier of people learning actually to code in YScript. I won't make any changes here, so I'll cancel out that, and then we can sort of look at this here further. Now, in terms of the other things we can do once you develop the code, if you go to the DataLex community, there's a lot of different examples. You can look at how the various code bases are developed and on in various areas. What I wanted to show, though, is once you have developed the code base, we can actually add different interfaces and themes on top of that. Okay, so the code base in a way is separate to how the application can be developed. Now, I think up to now, we've looked at what we call the development interface. So basically it gives you all the details about the facts, the conclusions the system can draw based on the code. But a lot of the time when we're developing end user interfaces, we don't actually want them to see everything. Okay, and we might want it to display in a different way. So the first example I was going to use is that if you look at the String Formulations Act that Andrew has been using throughout this presentation. So we were looking at development interface before. So what I've done here is just to give to demonstrate this. We just take the same code base, but this time we lay it on top of a fairly simple card interface. And of course, you know, you can, if I string this, it works on the mobile, etc. So it's responsive. As well in terms of looking at this. And then you can see, you can wrap this around or integrate this in other applications as well. So this is a fairly simple card interface. You've seen the way the system works, so I won't dwell on this. Now, another example that I wanted to show here is the Modern Slavery Act. This is a new act that's sort of at the Commonwealth level, making sure new regimes in terms of reporting, in terms of supply chain and so on. So again, we would have the code base for these looks like, I can just show you very quickly. It looks like the YScript that you've seen before, but this time I wrapped it around a much more end user oriented interface there. So just to show you quickly, I'm just going to use a simple hypothetical example. Telstra, no, it's not individual, but you can also include videos if you wanted to help explain how to answer that question or to provide more details about this. Okay, yes. Yes, they're a company for that reporting period. Yes, it was incorporated in Australia. So we can say uncertain, just so that it ends up with the report. So you notice here, we're using the YScript code base, but we can create different interface on top of that. Now, the other interesting example here for the Modern Slavery Act is that we have demonstrated the using the same code base and creating separate application on top. But what we can also do, and I think it relates to a point that Andrew made previously, is about how we can make the law more accessible or adding layers on top of the primary sources itself. So for the Modern Slavery Act, we actually integrate the Act, as well as on AustLII, as you can see the content of it, but we integrate the consultation process and the DataLex within the Act itself. So if you browse through different sections, so if I look at section 14 about joint modern slavery statements, on the right-hand side here, you can actually say, I want to consult what section 14 is. So I can actually see what the legislation is. So I can actually click on it, and then it takes you to a consultation session as well. Okay, and then you can just test out how that works. Okay, so that's another way of actually showing what the interface could be and how it can integrate with the primary sources to add another layer in terms of what we can do with the code base. So just finally, I just want to go back to a slide. Just in conclusion, Andrew sort of explained what YScript can do, and in terms of the language and how expressive it is. Okay, so we think that YScript it's ready. And as we have on our site, a number of examples, some of them fairly large examples of what we can do in terms of transforming existing code, existing rule into code. And we don't think it's very difficult to learn. Now, one of the key distinguishing features of this YScript language, I think, is that a quasi sort of natural language. So for lawyers, it looks like English enough for them to understand what it is that the code is about. And I think for coder, as Andrew's mentioned, you actually don't need a lot of keywords to get it to a stage where it is actually functional. And what I've sort of shown very briefly is that once you have the code base, you can actually develop very interesting applications on top. You can have some of those that are more end user oriented, or you can have those that are more internal and for more intermediaries. But the main point here is that all of that can be developed from the same code base, which I think that the ability to reuse code, to me is also very important there. Now, in terms of some of our plans going forward, we are very actively developing tools and other technologies to help with that process. The YLegis preprocessor is an example, and we're actually doing a lot of development around that to make it recognize more structures, to see how else we can simplify, in particular, those millions of legislative sections that we have to deal with. And as Andrew mentioned at the end of his part, that we hope that maybe by demonstrate what can be done, it might take a while to convince drafters, but if it could be drafted in the way of the YLegis style, YScript style, if you like, then it will make that process of going from rules or from legislation to code to applications, if you like, that process much more smooth. And I think that it will have a lot of potential in terms of how we can deal with making the law more accessible. But also, I think from economics, how if we can actually have more digital application on top of the legislation, the compliance, but also some of the new application that could be developed based on the ability to have executable code, I think would be very interesting. And that's why this area is still emerging, but I think has a huge potential both from an access perspective, but also from an economics perspective as well. So I'd like to end on that note and open up to questions and so on. There's already a lot in the Q&A, so maybe we'll pick a few. Maybe Natalia can help us pick a few. Andrew and my contacts are there, but please have a look at datalex.org and have a look at the examples that we've provided there. So thanks, Natalia. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Philip. That was excellent. Thank you for giving so generously of your experience and insights in relation to rules as code and the art of the possible. Truly inspiring. Executable code law in that form will be certainly very transforming. Now for questions and answers. The questions have been flooding in, so thank you everyone for your questions. I've grouped questions into 4 categories. So we perhaps will start with some of the technical questions about about AustLII DataLex, around YScript, for example. Then we have questions that look at future and rule of code and futures, some questions there, professional development and commercial applications. So let's just start with the technical questions. From an anonymous member of the audience, there are a number of RSA platforms out there. What are the key advantages of AustLII DataLex? You've already spoken about many of the advantages, but if you were going to give, the top 3 advantages, what would they be, please, Andrew?
Well, I guess we see particularly the YScript language as being quite flexible, as something which is capable of representing pretty much any piece of legislation. We think it provides, I guess, also a base level language which you can build other things on top of. So, I mean, we've been building this YLegis system on top of YScript. I think it's possible to build other types of systems that other people may be developing that could make use of it. I think it's fairly unique in its ability to be able to take natural language propositions and render them directly as dialogue, at least in a language as such. I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's quite like anything else that's out there. I think it's got a relatively unique place in the rules as code sort of market, if you like, as much as there is a market. They're the main things.
Phil, is there anything you'd like to add?
I was just going to say, I think it's also, what's also interesting is that this is developed through a lawyer, more legal oriented, as opposed to coming from purely a computer science sort of perspective. And I know it's very nuanced, but I think there would be difference in the approaches. And both Andrew and I have both computer science and law degrees. So I guess in a way, we see ourselves as a bridge, if you like, between the two. And this is why we've been working in this area. And then we're saying, okay, if someone with legal sort of experience wanting to come through into the rules as code, what could we do to help them get into it, rather than having a distinct group of two separate sets of people, those with legal expertise and those with computer science. Now, of course, we advocate an interdisciplinary team, if you like, but I think it helps if the language itself, at the underpinning of that, comes from that perspective. I think it actually influences the way the language is designed, and also influence the interfaces themselves that we're developing and demonstrating. So I think that combination is quite unique.
Fantastic. It's a very technical question. Can we run our own YScript system? Can we use an external editor such as VS Code to edit YScript code? And another related or similar question, similar vein, technical. So what license is YScript available under? And can you use YScript for laws in other languages?
Lots of very good questions. Yeah, we haven't quite figured out what we're going to release YScript under, but we are going to release the actual interpreter so that the YScript language is available. We're still sorting through which of the licenses we're likely to use, but in the meantime, if people are really, really keen, we can provide a functioning version of the central YScript interpreter just on a sort of user demonstration basis for personal use just for the next month or two while we get our act together. You can interface to it. Yeah, there's examples in the documentations. It's implemented as a library. So it's got a formal API to the interpreter, and you can interface with it, at least in terms of the examples in the documentation and in the distribution, from currently Ruby, Perl, Python, C, C++. I haven't done a Java one, but somebody else might write a nice Java one for me. So it interfaces to most other languages. And thank you for the question about other languages than English. I'd love to produce a version in French or something else. It is very, it's got a lightweight natural language processor in it, which is how it manages to do the their proposition transformations. But you know, it would be a really fun thing to adapt that to work in languages other than English. Yeah, it would be fun to collaborate with somebody to do that.
Just one further technical question from Mark Staples. Thank you, Mark. How does YScript represent exceptions or exclusions to a section that are written in some other section while maintaining isomorphism? Also, how does YScript represent propositions about obligations, permissions for something versus propositions about the thing actually having happened? Who'd like to answer that question?
It's probably me again. Well, so the latter part, because it's propositional, it doesn't care. Like a proposition can contain any sort of logic. So, you know, it can be deontic or whatever you like. It doesn't really, it doesn't mind. A proposition is, in a sense, indivisible. You know, it's something which, you know, it doesn't need to contain any formal system of logic. I mean, having said that, we do have in mind some ideas to extend the language to allow it to take on multiple subjects. Like if you're watching, I don't think we actually introduced it, but if you're looking carefully at some of the code, there's a concept in YScript of a named subject. And one of the ideas is to extend that concept to include multiple named subjects and have multiple versions of those in propositions, which would end up allowing you to do, you know, predicate calculus and beyond within what is otherwise a propositional environment. But that's a development of the language which no doubt we'll get to in due course. So in terms of exceptions, it's a good question. A lot of legislation now doesn't make those links between sections explicit. Like if you remember at the beginning of my paper, I was saying that one of the sorts of propositions that is often in legislation is something like subject to section 23 and something else. When that happens, well, it's straightforward. Sometimes it doesn't. So for example, in the hairdresser's example, there's a section 3 that says, you know, if you're cutting hair for money, then you can't cut hair. But then there's another section 5 that says section 3 doesn't apply if. Okay, and so the two things aren't really explicitly linked. And part of the process when you're writing YScript code, if you're just following through the normal methodology, is you go through it and try not to think about those issues too much when you're doing the first cut. But then to make it all hang together and to make it, you know, all work well, you know, you go back and you identify those connections and you have to stick them in. And you know, it's unfortunate they weren't in the original legislation. And this is one of the things which I was inserting in that hairdresser's example, you know, which I'm suggesting that if you want to draft legislation that is executable as code directly, you know, from a human format to machine format, you really need to make those interconnections explicit.
Fabulous. So questions in relation to rule of law, RAC futures, for example. How can we build fairness into rules as code? You spoke about transparency. How does DataLex make that happen?
Phil, your territory, I think.
I think that a number of ways, actually. In fact, I think the way we're talking about is that at the moment we are modeling, if you like, what it you know, say rather than what it does. So a lot of the time, this won't be an issue in terms of coding that. Now, but in terms of the so the legislation itself, I mean, if that's what we're modeling, it's whatever it says. So we're not trying to put in an interpretation layer on top. Now, but when it comes to the interface between, you know, when you're actually running it, and I think this is where the interface question becomes more important. And this is why, as I try to demonstrate with the linking aspect of it, I think I also want to pick up another, I think a few comments about discretion. You know, how do you interpret some of the sections or concepts within that? And I think, at least at the moment, our thinking is, given that a lot of the time, those of discretion are not actually explicit, some of them, and there's some of them very broad. So you need to somehow bring in interpretation through case law or even, you know, explanatory materials and so on. So one way we are suggesting that if some key concept, you actually could link. I've demonstrated an example where you could link some of the key concept to a section, but you actually can link it to a search on AustLII or anywhere else for that matter. Where say if there's a concept that's been interpreted by the court, then you can actually link, construct a search and actually bring back some of the case law that actually talk about that concept. Okay, so that's why you use the code as your starting point, and then you add layers or interfaces, if you like, on top that helps the user, depending on the application you're building, and how you can get to the answer. So the code itself may not solve everything, and I don't think that's the purpose of our approach. What we're saying is you might need other extrinsic materials to help you interpret if it becomes an end user application. I think that's the key point. Rather than being stuck on trying to solve everything in the code, what we're saying is code it as what the legislation actually say. Then we build on top with different layers, and you may need other materials to come in. And I think it'll also address a point about, I think there was a question for the judges and judiciary in terms of how they look at this. I think some of that, rather than coding it, is just actually look at what's being said and build interface on top of that to help you answer some of those questions.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you for answering the additional question there. Let's move to professional development. So we have a question from our Society's Next Gen project leader. What is your advice for new graduates and students interested in law? Should they take up coding?
Ooh. Yes.
Yes. I think that's
question, sorry.
I've got a story. I can do this. Yeah, look, we've been teaching this stuff for a little while, and I think that one of the advantages in teaching a lawyer to code, and in particular, one of the advantages in getting them to actually take a piece of legislation and convert it into something like YScript, is they actually develop a really deep understanding about the stuff that they're modeling, but also about more generally about how law works. But just in case, just as far as the stuff they're modeling, Phil and I did a class, when was it, last Friday, a few days ago. And we were teaching a bunch of tax students, and they didn't have any interest in rules as code. They didn't have any interest in the technology. It wasn't a law tech class. It was a tax class. You'd think tax is pretty focused. But what they got from it, and what I think the course director was aiming to achieve, was that if you've got to sit down and think about how these fundamental sections of the tax legislation actually work, when you finished it, you really know how those sections work. And if there's any nuances, if there's ambiguities, if there's inconsistencies, if there's things that are unusual about the way those sections work, you have an understanding of that more than anybody else. You know the nuts and bolts of exactly how that works. And so I think teaching people to code this stuff is a really good way of teaching law. And as I say, also it makes people reflect, I think, on what law is, and what are the limits of legislation. It makes people reflect upon the issues of how open textured the law is. That there are limits. You can have principle after principle, or section or subsection after subsection, but at the end of the day, you bump into this open textured problem where it's a problem in the sense of a logical sense. What do I do when I hit one of these? I guess it's a living as far as lawyers are concerned. But yeah.
Can I just add, Andrew, that I also think, in fact, a lot of the thought process that the lawyer would, like a trained lawyer would have in terms of the skills and in terms of the thinking, actually is very conducive to coding, because a lot of the times you have to think very logically. Right. And so for those that are contemplating coding, I think it's not just, I don't think on either end. I mean, if some of the coders want to pick up some of the law, that's not a bad thing. But if the lawyers that are interested in coding, it's a really fairly logical process. And I think a lot of it's sort of in line with what lawyers actually think. And that's another way of looking at it. Now, when we say coding, it doesn't actually mean you need to take up a computer science degree, unless of course, you want to do that. That's fine too. I think the other thing to note, though, with the rule as code, but more generally with legal tech, I think, as lawyers, a lot of the times we would be, as future lawyers, if you like, a lot of times you will be brought into a project that involves technology. Okay, now, obviously you've got a lot of the technologists talking in a language. Even though we're using the same words, we've been in situations where we have to wear different hats. We can use the same word, but depending on the context or depending on the audience, it means differently. So to a computer science, say a risk, cyber risk may mean something, okay? But to a lawyer, risk might mean something else, okay? But I think it's more important that you get on top of some of the technology, and that because lawyers are involved in a lot of those transactions, being on top of the technology, I think would be very helpful. And of course, specifically, it's about rule as code. Yes, knowing a little bit of coding, or knowing what, when you look at a bit of code, you can say, yes, it is what it's supposed to be, or isn't, I think would be a very good starting point. Okay, so you don't need to be a coder necessarily, but just understanding what the code is. And when people say rule as code, you say, yep, I know exactly what to be looking at. And what the gotchas are, as opposed to saying, oh, well, it's all about computer programming. No, it isn't. I guess that's really what we're saying. It actually is within the territory of the legal thinking, if you spend a little bit of time just getting on top of that technology.
Fantastic, thank you. Unfortunately, we have to end Q&A there. On behalf of the Australian Society for Computers and Law, thank you, Andrew and Philip, for sharing your deep expertise. I have no doubt that your efforts will make the law more effectively accessible, as you put it, Andrew, and in doing so, drive economic and societal good. So thank you very much. Also, a huge thank you to the University of Newcastle, and in particular, Professor Tanya Sorden, Dean and Head of Newcastle University Law School, for making this platform available for the masterclass today, and also for your ongoing support, a true friend of the Society. Now for some of our upcoming events. We have Going Digital, COVID Passports and Your Data, an expert panel discussion. So look out for this session, please. We will also be presenting our 4th Rules as Code Masterclass, featuring Open FISCA, Code for Australia, and representatives from the New South Wales Department of Customer Service. So please join us for that. And the 3rd event chronologically is another expert panel looking at the changing risk profile of technology products and services with leading experts in cyber risk and insurance. So be sure to subscribe to the Australian Society for Computers and the Law to receive invitations to these events. Also, a quick reminder, do join the ANZ RSC Community of Practice, founded by our Society, with Code for Australia and La Trobe University. Links will be sent to all those who register for this masterclass. Thank you again to our presenters this evening, Professor Andrew Mowbray and Associate Professor Philip Chung, and also Professor Tanya Sorden and University of Newcastle. I'm Natalia Crnomarkovic. Thank you very much for joining us today. Stay well, stay safe, and till next time. Thank you, everyone.